Well, U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs aren't going anywhere just yet. One day after a federal U.S. trade court ruled that Trump's most sweeping tariffs are illegal, the U.S. Federal Appeals Court has decided to keep those tariffs in place while the White House fights the decision. And today, the Trump administration threatened to escalate to the Supreme Court.
The courts should have no role here. There is a troubling and dangerous trend of unelected judges inserting themselves into the presidential decision-making process. America cannot function if President Trump, or any other president for that matter, has their sensitive diplomatic or trade negotiations railroaded by activist judges.
Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield led one of the two lawsuits the court decided in yesterday's ruling. I spoke to him today just before the appeals court reinstated the tariffs. Attorney General Rayfield, it's good to have you back. Thanks for being here today, sir.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me.
The court took your side, arguing that Trump's broad-based tariffs were beyond his authority and illegal. What do you make of this ruling?
Look, it's a pretty simple ruling, right? You have a panel of 3 judges, 2 of which were appointed by Republicans, that unanimously decided that President Trump had misused his emergency power. It's pretty significant, and it's a big win. And obviously, this will go through the continued legal process here in our courts.
The White House said they're going to apply for relief. They're going to go to the federal court. And they said today, Caroline Leavitt did at the White House podium, that this will ultimately have to go to the Supreme Court. Do you expect that that's where this is going to go next? And how long do you think that will take?
Yeah, the first steps is the Trump administration is trying to really stop this 3-panel judge from implementing their ruling. And so they filed for what they call a stay motion, right, which would be to halt this court's actions. And they've done that not only in the Court of International Trade, but they're doing it in the federal district, which is in Washington, D.C. Eventually, we'll have arguments on the merits within that district in D.C., that federal district. And pending that, you could have the case be appealed to the Supreme Court. But it does seem like that the president is posturing as though that they really want this to go to the Supreme Court.
Right. The line from the White House last night in a written statement, today at the podium from a spokesperson, Caroline Leavitt, is, this is not a quote, but a paraphrase, activist judges, usurping the president's trade and diplomatic agenda, undermining the credibility of the United States on the international stage, and suggesting that it actually undermines his constitutional authority, Donald Trump's as president, to deal with trade issues. I mean, what's your response to that sort of rhetoric coming from the White House?
The first is it's absolutely rhetoric, and those are the type of things you say when you're losing consistently in court. To sit there and attack a foundational hallmark principle of a democracy, the independent judiciary, is about as low as it gets. This is something that is founded in most democracies in the modern world, right? Having an independent judiciary and really attacking their independence, I find incredibly fascinating. I find it incredibly ironic that he's attacking a judge that he himself, Donald Trump, appointed on this panel. 2 out of the 3 were Republican judges. Again, a bipartisan, unanimous panel agreed in this manner. And really, this is the foundation and hallmark of our democracy. And if we need the Supreme Court to sit there and tell the president what the Constitution says, I'm all for it.
Yes, there is an irony in attacking unelected judges for this, but then asking other layers of unelected and appointed judges to overrule them. But here we are. I mean, the tariffs that deal with Canada specifically were under the emergency powers that he cited to deal with fentanyl. And it doesn't target drug trafficking. It doesn't tariff fentanyl, obviously, because it's an illegal substance. And it was essentially ruled that there is no emergency here, and it's an abuse of power. But other tariffs on steel, on aluminum, on other national economic emergency legislation, those stay in place even with this result, correct?
Yeah, and so our lawsuit was really targeted on 4 different executive orders. So it didn't include all of the different tariffs that President Trump has put forth. And so specifically with Canada, that was attacking the fentanyl issue and whether those tariffs were actually tied to an end, right? Was it actually trying to effectuate the outcome of the emergency? And the court ruled that, a broad tax on everything, that 10% worldwide tariff, and it was not related and was, in your case with the fentanyl, it was not related to fentanyl under those circumstances. In fact, it was very interesting in the argument. You had some of the judges pointing out the disparity between Mexico and Canada with respect to the supply of fentanyl coming into the United States, pointing out I think it was 3% come from Canada. So it wasn't really tied to the outcomes that he was trying to achieve in his emergency order.
I wonder what you just make of this moment, because we have had an election since you and I last spoke, and with the re-election of the Liberal government here in Canada, and so much of it to do with Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister, his understanding of the global economic trading system. And we've had a speech from the throne this week, which King Charles came and delivered, talking about the unraveling of the global trade order, largely because of the actions of your president. And here we have this rebuke from a trade court with 2 Republican judges, one that Trump appointed. I mean, what do you just make of this moment that the judiciary is trying to rein in the president for using authority that constitutionally rests with your Congress and is upsetting your allies?
First, and I mentioned you two earlier, is that your understanding of our Constitution seems to be better than our own president's, because you're exactly right that our Constitution of the United States gives the sole power to Congress to set tariffs. Same thing with taxation. And they delegated some of that power to our president under our laws. They call them Title 19. And they have certain specific safeguards, sideboards that the president must follow to really make sure that our economy is protected, our consumers are protected, our small business are protected. The trade policy enacted by Congress is adhered to. We respect our relationships. President Trump's actions has completely upended that. And so for me, as someone who really believes in the foundation and hallmark of a democracy, an independent judiciary standing up and exercising their power to a co-equal branch of government, in this case our president, just shows that democracy does work.
So this will undoubtedly make its way to the Supreme Court, because it seems unlikely that Congress will intervene to sort of try to reassert its control over trade, just given the capture of the Republican members of Congress in particular. What about the other tariffs that have been in place? I know you say this particular lawsuit focused on those 4 executive orders, but there are other disruptive trade action that the president has taken, which other people feel have dubious claims as their foundation. Is there a possibility for further litigation from the state of Oregon and your other partners on this, or are you going to just stay focused on the 4 that led to this judgment?
Yeah, and right now we're focused on the 4 orders, right? Because there was a direct nexus to the impact to Oregon, and in the court system, you got to have that direct impact in some of these different areas. And so this is where we felt we could make our best case to really highlight how unconstitutional the president's actions were under this scenario. And so we're moving forward in that. Now that could have ripple impacts, right? The way that these are coming down, and if you have the further courts continuing to uphold these rulings, that will change the manner in which the president would use an emergency power to set tariffs, right? And hopefully shuttle him into Title 19, which is where a lot of the tariff power resides and where Congress intended that power to reside as they delegated it to the president. If President Trump does not start changing those actions, which are consistent with how the courts are ruling, I would expect people impacted by those tariffs to file lawsuits, because those would be slam dunk cases moving forward if they were inconsistent with the rulings of the court.
So the tariffs against Canada and Mexico, fentanyl was the argument there. But he also speaks quite extensively about the idea of a trade deficit and referring to it as a subsidy. There still is legal authority for the president under other laws to bring in tariffs to deal with trade deficits. So they would be time limited for about 150 days, as I understand it. That is an option that is available to him. Do you think he could pivot to that, or do you think he's I guess maybe it's unfair to ask you to read the mind of Donald Trump, but I just wonder where you think this may go in terms of his actions if he doesn't win the legal challenge.
Yeah, there's always a question of whether pivot is in the vocabulary of our president. But in terms of what could you do, right, legally, Title 19, which is that law that we talked about that Congress passed to delegate responsibility for tariffs to the president. But again, this is what the president doesn't like, because there's sideboards. And you mentioned one of those sideboards, right? And you can call them sideboards. You can also call them safeguards for our economy. So there's that 150-day time frame, which you mentioned, that limits those powers. There's certain thresholds about how high the tariffs can be, right? And you also have to have factual findings. It is not unusual, right, that we would have a trade deficit with certain countries that don't have a lot of exports.
Right.
What do we have to gain under that? And so there's a lot of lack of continuity, especially when we're thinking about that 10% across the board worldwide tariff order that the president issued.
Dan Rayfield, Attorney General of Oregon, it's good to have you back on the show. Perhaps we'll speak again after the next legal ruling on this particular case. Thanks for your time, sir.
Thank you. Good to see you.